My name is Alicia Middleman. I'm a curator at the Estes Park Museum. Today is Friday, March 21st, 2014, and we are at the Estes Park Museum. We're about to interview Tommy Caldwell for the Estes Valley Mountaineering Oral History Project. It's a joint project between the Estes Valley Library and the Estes Park Museum. We're going to talk to him a little bit about growing up in Estes Park and developing some roots here, and what's next in climbing. Just to get started, what is your full name?
Thomas Michael Caldwell.
Okay. And when and where were you born?
I was born in Loveland, Colorado in 1978.
When did you move to Estes Park?
I moved to Estes Park around the time I was 4 years old.
Okay, and your father taught at a school in Loveland, right?
Yeah, my dad taught at Bill Reed Middle School in Loveland, Colorado.
So about the time that you moved up to Estes Park, that's close to the time that you did that famous climb with him up the Owls of the Twin Owls.
Yeah, that was actually probably before we moved to Estes. We moved here because we lived down the hill and we'd come here every weekend anyways and totally fell in love with the valley. So my first climbing done up here in Estes was when I was 3 years old, my first roped climbing. That's what my family did. And we climbed the boughs of the owls up the back of Twin Owls.
And do you have any memories of that day?
Not really. I mean, I think my mind recreates those memories a little bit because I was so young, but I do kind of vaguely remember going through the chimneys and the narrow corridors, and when I was 3 years old, I wasn't much of a climber, so it was more about my dad tying me into the other end of the rope and dragging me up to the top of the mountain. But I loved it. I mean, I loved being outside with family, so yeah, it was cool.
What came after that?
Well, I just kind of became one of the rambunctious little kids around here in Estes. I remember spending my summers riding all over the place on my mountain bike. My dad would oftentimes go off on climbing expeditions because he was a mountain guide for the Colorado Mountain School. So our family, during the summers, we would travel all over the western United States. And then we'd climb on Lumpy Ridge a lot when I was, probably until the time I was 9 or 10. We did a lot of climbing on Lumpy Ridge, and I just remember cruising around the rocks and playing at the base and just being a little crag kid, me and my sister.
And was it on one of those family road trips that you pulled up to Devil's Tower and climbed there?
Yeah, we climbed a lot in Yosemite. We went to Yosemite every summer. We went to Devil's Tower. I don't really remember that one because I was really young then too. I think I was 4 years old when we went up and we climbed Devil's Tower. There wasn't many climbers that were that young back then, so people thought that my family was super weird for going out and dragging little kids up these big rocks.
And then when you come back to Estes Park, if your father was a guide with CMS, you were probably around some other climbers, and were there any guides that you remember spending time with?
Yeah, I mean, my dad was, my mom also worked for Colorado Mountain School for a bunch of years. So when I wasn't at school, usually I was hanging out at the building. And I even remember when it was in what is now the guide shack, the little building up there, and then the big building down the hill was Comito's at the time, and then eventually the mountain school moved into that building. But yeah, I mean, there'd be these great guide meetings up at the Donahue's house in Allen's Park, and I remember hanging out with Tobias Donahue, who's one of my good friends, and playing around in the woods and having big campfires while all the guides were hanging out in the house, having these, I guess, meetings, but really more like parties. And then during the day, after school, I would walk over to Colorado Mountain School every day and hang out there. I remember Mike Donahue most vividly, just because he was such a kind and thoughtful man. He was a really great guy. And then Topher, his older son, became a good friend of mine later in life. But My 5th grade school teacher here in Estes was Bill McKee, and he was also a guide for Colorado Mountain School. So I remember him really well, and a great family friend. Yeah, there was a lot of them, though.
Wow. And so were your adventures year-round? In the wintertime, what did you do?
We did a lot of backcountry skiing in the winter. I definitely remember getting dragged across some of the lakes by the wind when I was just 4 or 5 years old out on, they didn't even really make very good ski equipment for kids that young, so I was always breaking my skis in half and having to ride on my dad's shoulders to get back out of the trails up there in the park. There was a lot less people on the trails back then, I think, in the winter at least.
Sure. So you became pretty familiar with Rocky Mountain National Park at a young age, doing year-round activities there. That's really neat. Was there some kind of competition between your father and some of the other CMS guides going up towards Hallett's Peak?
Yeah, I do remember that a little bit. I think it was probably around the time I was 7 or 8 years old, the Colorado Mountain School decided that they wanted to do a little competition where all the guides, I think, started at the mountain school, and then they're all supposed to head up, climb a route on Hallett's, and then run across the divide and climb a route on the Petit Pond. And my dad decided to take me along on that, and we had one of his other best friend as well. So it was the 3 of us that was our team.
And you did it. You completed it.
Yeah, it was cool. It was my dad was such a strong person in the mountains, and I could kind of draft off him, and he would drag me up these pretty cool big rock walls from the time I was really young, which was a great experience. So I learned to love the mountains, and I learned kind of what adventure was. I learned about thunderstorms. I learned about all these mountain things when I was super young.
Did you have any close calls with thunder or anything like that when you were young?
There's so much lightning around here in the summers. If you're on top of the mountains very much at all, you're gonna be around it or near it. There's no time that I remember thinking that I was close to death or anything like that, but I do remember being quite excited and having to run down from the tops of mountains as thunderstorms approached. When I climbed the Diamond for the first time, I was 12 years old, and I remember big ice chunks falling out of the D1 chimney and kind of floating around us, and that seemed quite intimidating to me at the time.
I bet.
Yeah.
How did you feel when you finished that climb?
I was just a little kid. It's kind of what we did. I might have gotten the same feeling that another kid gets at a little league baseball game or something. It was just fun and exciting, and something that I got to do with my dad, and my dad was totally my hero at the time. So if you ask my mom about it, she said I had motivation to climb in the mountains. For my 7th or 8th birthday, she said it was my idea to go and actually hike up Long's Peak for the first time. She's like, we didn't really push you to do it. We didn't say, it's like you came to us and told us you thought you were ready to go hike Long's Peak. So I don't remember that, but I do remember loving being in the mountains with my family.
Yeah, and you got some press for it in our local paper. The Trail Gazette claimed that you're the youngest person to climb the Diamond.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's still true.
That was fun for me at that age, yeah, to get in the local newspaper.
That's really neat. At what point did you begin competing?
My first climbing competition was at a small climbing gym in Boulder called Cats, and I was probably around 11 years old. I was the only one that entered the kids division, so.
So you won?
Yeah, so I won. Yeah, they gave me the prizes for first, second, and third place because I was the only one in it. But I think there's a lot of years in there where I wasn't really that interested in climbing. That's kind of what my family did. I would rather hang out with my friends. But probably around the time I entered middle school, I got back into climbing because my dad was a teacher at Billard Middle School, and that's where I went to middle school as well. And he started a climbing program, so suddenly a lot of my friends were climbing as well, and it was something that I knew, it was something I could go and do with them. So that's when I really started to sort of take it up with my own motivations and not just because it was what my family did.
At the 1995 Outdoor Sports Festival in Snowbird, Utah, do you have memories of that competition?
Yeah, I mean, I was 17 years old, so that was probably, that might have been the next competition after the one I did when I was 11. I wasn't doing too many competitions, but we were traveling around and doing a lot of sport climbing. My dad and I had started to develop the Monastery, our local sport climbing crag, and I was starting to train a little bit and decided to go and enter that competition. And it was cool for me because all of the people that I knew about in climbing, Boulder has always been such a hub for climbing, and there's a lot of good climbers down there, and they had entered the comp, so I really kind of entered it just to meet these people and be around them. And I thought it would be cool to see what a climbing competition was like.
And you won it.
Yeah, and I totally shocked my dad and me by winning it. We had just been doing our own thing in climbing. I had no idea how I measured up to other people. So that was the first moment where I was like, wow, this is, I've actually made some progress at this sport. I'm pretty good at it.
Let's go back to those middle school years when you started to climb with some friends and kind of had more of an opportunity to socialize with other people your age doing it. Did you get to climb with your friends outside, or was?
Well, I climbed with my friends during the school year in the school program, and then part of that school program was going to places like Shelf Road in southern Colorado or Rifle, and going to the climbing areas locally, Lumpy Ridge. We did a few trips like that, and those were great. But mostly I did my local climbing in the summer with friends that I would meet around here, and most of the time I was 13, 14, 15 years old, and I was climbing with 18, 19, 20-year-olds, partially because they had driver's licenses, but also there just weren't other young kids climbing at that time. So I always had restaurant jobs downtown, and so I'd meet other people that were into climbing, and we'd get up early and go to Lumpy Ridge and climb, and then come back and work our jobs at night.
Oh. Downtown in Estes Park?
Yep.
Yeah, where'd you work?
I worked at a Mexican food restaurant called La Casa that's no longer there. It's where Kirk's Fly Shop is now, for a bunch of years. Before that, I worked at Caramel Corn. I'm not even sure if that's here. Just a little candy store. When I was 11, I actually got a job at a hamburger joint that's no longer here over across from the Country Supermarket. So I was always a bus boy or a dishwasher.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, you made reference to the monastery. Let's talk about that. Can you explain how you and your father went about doing some of the route development there?
There was a climber in town named Lawrence Dempke who was into sport climbing, which there wasn't really any sport climbing around here back then. There was a couple routes. Bolting was actually super controversial. But he found this outcropping of rocks down near Drake by plane. I think he had gone up in a plane with somebody and spotted it by air, and then went in there and actually kind of looked around, and then got so excited about it that he brought my dad in the next day, and then he got excited about it, and we bought a power drill, and we went there and we started bolting sport routes. And I think we found it in October, and we're so excited that we would drive up that road in our little tube-wheel drive Honda and have to push it up the road to the monastery, and we actually bolted this crag through the winter. So it was rough. It was super windy up there and below zero a lot of the time, and we'd put on all of our clothes and go up there and establish this sport climbing area so that the next spring we'd be able to go and have a lot of climbs to do. But sport climbing in general was getting popular in the United States. So we saw it as the future. All the old traditional climbs on Lumpy were kind of old school to us at that point, and we felt like we were on the forefront of something new and something cool.
So there wasn't any doubt in your mind at the time that bolting was a good thing to do in that area?
I think I just looked to my dad. We knew it was legal because we researched that it was on national forest land, and you're allowed to do it there. My dad just saw it as kind of the next big thing in climbing, and that was the way forward. And he doesn't think too much about what other people are gonna think of it, and so we did it. And I think because it wasn't alongside traditional climbs, it was not easy to protect with gear. It worked out. Nobody complained. Nobody really got mad at us about it. But I do remember at first we would bolt climbs, and if there was any chance to put in natural protection, we wouldn't put a bolt there. And so it was kind of this weird hybrid where you'd have to climb with a few pieces of gear, and then later other people came back and put in bolts at all those, and it became just a complete sport climbing area, which really it's better off that way.
Before we get into the specifics of some of the routes there, tell me a little bit more about how you and your dad persevered during those really windy, cold times that you're out there drilling. I understand that you guys had a method of putting your hands in snow to make them numb.
We figured out climbing in the winter that our hands would freeze. So, but then they would get to a point where they got so cold, and ice climbers know this, that then your body would warm up, and then they would get flushed with blood, and you'd get this sensation that actually really hurts when they got flushed with blood, but then they wouldn't get cold again. So when we'd go climbing at the monastery, we would purposely make that happen at the beginning of the day in the winter. Most of the time we just bolted, but we did get so excited about some of our routes that we tried to climb them in the winter. And so that's what we do. We'd put our hands in the snow, let them freeze, take them out, and let them get that rush of blood, and then we were able to climb without our hands freezing.
Wow. Okay. So you got a little bit of climbing in, but mostly kind of setting the stage for what would come in the spring and the summertime there.
Yep.
Well, there are some pretty famous routes there. The Dreamcatcher and then Third Millennium. Can you tell me about those?
The area is a series of towers, and it's geologically pretty fascinating. Three sides of the towers is this very knobby rock that was obvious to us from the beginning that seemed pretty climbable. But then one side was covered in this patina that looks like wood grain. It's super beautiful, but from the ground, they look pretty blank because all the holds are these little seams and they're inset. So at first we didn't think that they were climbable at all. We thought that those walls would be impossible to climb, but eventually we decided to take a look, and we found all these secret little holds, and then we bolted a few routes, and they turned out to be amazing. I mean, I feel like they're some of the best sport climbing in Colorado, and it was so cool to come across that and discover something like that and be part of developing it. And so some of the routes have become quite well known. People from around the country or even around the world will come to specifically do these climbs just because they're very unique, and the rock is really good and they're beautiful.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a hike to get there.
Yeah, it's a nice hike in there, and it's just a nice area.
What motivated you guys to name the route Third Millennium?
I don't know. You'd have to ask my dad about that. He named all those routes. I don't even remember.
Okay.
My dad, I'm sure he has a whole story behind every name. He thinks a lot about that stuff, but I can't even remember.
I'm curious what brought you back there a couple years later to do the Grand Ole Opry?
Well, the Third Millennium was one of the blanker looking walls, and I bolted it and worked on it for a long time, and then it was my hardest sport climb. And then there's this piece of rock to the right, which was a little bit longer and a little bit more blank, and I went down it and put in a few nuts and tried top roping it and decided that it was completely impossible. But then my dad convinced me to go back like 3 or 4 years later and try it again. And it was funny because I did try it again. I was like, nope, this is still impossible. But he just kept urging me. He believed it was possible somehow. And so we decided to bolt it, and I started working on it and eventually figured out all the moves. And now it's a really famous, great climb.
Did it happen to be that there was one move or two moves that kind of unlocked it, or was it just a lot of hard work doing it over and over again?
It was at a point in my climbing where I was improving really fast, and I had no idea of my capabilities. I had no idea what was possible. So, I might think something was impossible one day and then be able to do it the next, and that's just what happened on that climb. I think the whole thing just seemed too hard. All the holds were small. It was too blank. It was, I could do a couple moves on the whole route, and then eventually I started to piece them all together, and that was such a cool process. And these days, I never really make claims. I never say things are impossible anymore because there's so many times when I think that's the case, and then younger kids will come along and do it. So,
you were one of those younger kids.
Yeah, yeah.
That brings up an interesting point about climbing, and where is that line of impossible and what is possible?
I mean, it's happened throughout climbing history. People think something will be impossible, and then somebody will prove that's not the case. So I don't think you can make claims like that.
That's really exciting.
Yeah.
So another great climb was Sarcasm, 514A at near Chasm Lake. That is a completely different environment. You're up in the Alpine. Where did that idea come from to go up and do that?
Well, I felt pretty attached to the diamond because, it's Colorado's premier big wall. It sits right above Estes. You can see it. But for a lot of years, for my teenage years, I was mostly a sport climber. But we had some friends in Boulder who went up and they did a climb on the ship's prow. They named it Baloney Pony, but they had skirted around this really clean arete at the bottom. And one of them believed that it was possible. The other one believed it wasn't possible. So they made a bet that if somebody could climb it someday, then the person who was right would have to take the other one to like the Flagstaff House in Boulder, which is a really fancy restaurant. Climbers were dirt poor. They can't afford going to restaurants like that. So they made this big bet, and then I was one of the people at that time that was going around and trying to do all the hardest routes in Colorado. So they came to me and they said, you should check this out. It's close to your home. The idea of sport climbing way up high in elevation in the alpine environment was something we just really hadn't even thought of back then. The monastery was a sport climbing area, but the diamond was kind of a trad climbing area. So we had to sort of look outside the box to think of climbing something that had no way to naturally protect it. It was going to have to be a sport climb, but it was so beautiful. It was a really clean line. So we decided to go up there and give it a shot, and we climbed the Baloney Pony, and then we had to rappel down, and we set up a top rope on that arete, and I started feeling for holds and trying to figure out if I could climb it, and then eventually we decided I could, and so we hand drilled all the bolts and put in a few days of work and climbed it, and it's beautiful. I feel super lucky to have come to the Estes area and seen these, been here at a time when these climbs were just becoming possible for me and for the world of climbing, because 5 years before that, nobody around could have done them, just because climbing gyms were enabling us to get stronger than people had been in the past.
Did you have any doubts about hand drilling that route? Because given that hand drilling is a lot of work, but it's also, when you do bolt something, it's kind of a gift to others so that they can get up there and climb it. But this is one at a really hard grade. Did you think, after I do this, who else will come here? I
don't think we gave that a whole lot of thought. I mean, I I was a teenager. I was at a point where I wanted to like prove myself in the world of climbing, and so we were trying to push the boundaries wherever we could, and that's why we bolted that climb. The idea of having a route that hard at a high elevation was cool to us, and I don't think we really bolted it as a gift for others. That would be nice to say that we did that, but I don't think that would be the truth.
Tommy, is this around the same time you mentioned going around the state? Was this the same time that you did Flex Luther?
Yeah, it probably was around that time. I mean, my dad was such a great partner for me, and we climbed everything together, and we went all over the place trying to figure out where the future of, where the hardest climbing was that we could find. But we were somewhat limited to the fact that I was still in high school, so we'd climb around here. A lot of times we'd go to the western slope of Colorado, and we got word of a big limestone cave over there, and we went and checked it out, and it looked great, so we started bolting it, and that's where Flex Luther is, and then another route that was one of the hardest sport climbs in America at the time, called Kryptonite. We named the crag the Fortress of Solitude because it was, everybody was going to Rifle, which is a nearby crag at the time, and Rifle, there's a road going right through it. There's a lot of people around. It's a picnic area. This was a similar type of climbing, but you had to walk an hour uphill, and there was nobody up there, so we felt like we had this whole cave to ourselves, and so we named it the Fortress of Solitude.
In that period when you were training so hard, can you explain what got you into that high level of climbing?
Well, climbing competitions were taking off. There was a whole circuit of national competitions. There was probably, like a whole climbing association had started, and they would host 6 regional climbing competitions around the country and then one national one. And I just started competing in those, and Boulder had a few climbing gyms that were some of the better ones in the country, and that's really what got me into trying to climb hard, was climbing competitions. I mean, it gave us a community that was something other than just me and my dad. It gave me other people to be motivated to climb with, and then just the whole idea of competing is a very motivating thing, especially for a teenager.
I bet.
Instead of, I ran cross country in middle school, and I was a wrestler all the way through my freshman year in high school, but then I started doing these climbing competitions, so that was my new sport. I was always part of it, but that's what I started competing in.
Yeah, and at that time, is it true that you became friends with folks like Chris Sharma, and you kind of build on that community of other climbers who would become sponsored and become professional climbers themselves?
Yeah, for sure. There wasn't, climbing gyms were getting popular, and therefore climbing was accessible to younger people at that time, became accessible to younger people right at that time that they started those competitions. So that circuit of competitions is where I met that whole generation of climbers. That's where we all got started. So we would meet at the climbing competitions, and then we would plan road trips together, and we all became really close friends.
But you would kind of later transition out of sport climbing and get back into traditional climbing, and I'm wondering why traditional climbing came to dominate your style later, and freeing a number of the climbs that had previously been aid climbed.
Unlike my friends that had started climbing in the climbing gyms, I had started climbing just a bit before that. So I had learned how to climb at places like Vita Vu and Lumpy Ridge, and so my first climbs were done on traditional gear. So I think it was probably around the time I was 17, I remember that some sport climbers from Europe, Alex and Tomas Huber, came to the United States and freed El Capitan in Yosemite. And it kind of opened my eyes. And Lynn Hill had freed the nose a few years before that. And it opened my eyes to the idea that people who were actually sport climbers could take that strength that they learned in sport climbing and take it to traditional climbing and big wall climbing. And I already had a little bit of knowledge when it came to traditional climbing. My dad was a great mentor. He had climbed El Cap a bunch of times when he was younger. So all of a sudden my focus went there. I decided that that's what I wanted to do. And so we went to Yosemite, or I went to the Utah desert first and kind of relearned how to crack climb because I hadn't really done it in 10 years. And then went to Yosemite and decided I was going to free climb the Salate Wall. And in terms of the grades of that, it didn't look that hard actually compared to what we had bolted at the monastery and climbed at the fortress. So I figured I'd just be able to go and do it. But I had no idea how hard it would be. So I went out there, and at first I climbed it with my dad, but we got totally shut down in trying to free climb it. It beat me up, but it was really exciting. You know, the exposure was huge. It was thrilling, unlike anything I had experienced in my life, and I just became fascinated with it. And then I started working on it more, and it turns out that my background of being in the mountains around here and learning a little bit about crack climbing and traditional climbing, but also just being kind of a tough kid from growing up, you know, getting blown across the lakes in Rocky Mountain National Park and skiing and bolting routes through the winter at the monastery. It made it so that I had a lot of the skills that were needed to transition to big wall free climbing. And it was just super exciting to be able to go to Yosemite and see El Cap as this thing that looked totally impossible and huge as a kid, and then come back thinking I could free climb it, but then get totally shut down, and then just like progressing to getting better and better at it, and then going there and having success and being able to establish new free routes. And yeah, it was just a really exciting time.
How old were you when you did the Salate Wall?
Well, I climbed it for the first time unsuccessfully. Well, we aid climbed it, so that might be confusing. We went there with the intention of free climbing it, but we got shut down, so we pulled on our gear and climbed it the more traditional way, which is aid climbing, and got to the top, I think, when I was 17 years old. And then I came back the next year having kind of obsessed about it and was able to successfully free climb at that time.
Why did you obsess over it?
Just because I know it was something that seemed so exciting, but I don't know, things that I felt like I should be able to do it, and I was wrong. I got so beat up on it, and the whole idea of sort of overcoming something that was so scary but at the same time exciting for me was something that I really wanted to do.
I'm going to hop back to talking about the diamond a little bit. Do you remember that day that you and Topher Donahue went up there and did 5 climbs in a row?
Yeah.
What was the plan that day?
The plan was to just climb as many routes as we could on the diamond in a day. Topher was really into these big link-ups. We sort of used the mountains around here as training for going to bigger mountains in other places in the world. And I hadn't done much of that, but Topher had. So the way to make the mountains here bigger is to just climb a lot of routes in a row. So that's why we went up there, and we had no idea how many we'd do. We just brought a bunch of food with us, and we climbed up to Broadway and left a bunch of stuff on Broadway, and then just started lapping the diamond. And yeah, it was a super cool day. I mean, I got to climb all over that wall in a single day, which was usually just going up there once and hiking down is so exhausting, and you just get one route out of it. So the idea of just only having to do the hike once, but doing 5 routes was really cool.
Wow. That must have been something else for the other climbers there, seeing you lap them a few times.
Yeah, I mean, Topher and I climbed really well together, so we did a lot of simul climbing, which means we weren't stopping to belay that much, and so we were able to climb really fast. It was really fun.
Yeah, seems like you were both kind of toughened up as kids in this environment here in Estes Park.
Yeah, the mountains here, they're not giant, but the weather's pretty harsh. And we both grew up in these households that were full of mountain climbers, and so that gave us the skills to do that kind of stuff.
How else has the climbing here prepared you for some of your adventures around the world?
I think more than anything, it sort of just lit the match at the beginning. You know, it was these mountains are beautiful, and my dad brought me into them, and I fell in love with them, and that just made me fall in love with climbing and then mountains around the world. So it all started here, and I was able to build upon that.
Could you maybe share some of the specifics of your training while you're in Estes and before you embarked for the Fitz Traverse, which you just accomplished with?
The specifics of well, Estes is a great place to come home to, partially because my family's here, and I just love the area. But also, it provides a perfect training ground for me. And for a long time, that was because of places like the monastery. There is a good place to go sport climbing. But more recently, it's because of the bouldering. This is really a bouldering hotspot now. People travel from all over the world, and the Estes Valley is known as one of the premier spots to come and go bouldering in the summer. And for me, bouldering is the best training I can do. So I always have tons of boulder problem projects in the Estes Valley, and that keeps me motivated. It gives me these little things to obsess on. It makes my fingers strong. And then I can go and ride my Bright bike up Trail Ridge Road, or go climb on the Diamond, and or go to the monastery. And there's just so many opportunities for great climbing around here, and you're always in this beautiful environment.
Oh, you like to go back to the monastery?
Yeah, I go there. I use it almost like a climbing gym in the summer. I go there and just try and climb routes that I've already done, and yeah, it's great.
That must be interesting for you to kind of see the Estes Valley and Rocky Mountain National Park, its reputation to climbers sort of evolve, for it first being known for the high peaks, and that was kind of the goal. And then you see Lumpy Ridge and some of the lower subalpine climbs be exciting for traditional climbers. And then you develop sport climbing, and now you see bouldering really shooting up here.
Yeah, it's provided a great venue for all types of climbing. I mean, it's really one of the best places around to climb, because it's got a little bit of everything.
Did you ever entertain the idea of living someplace else?
Oh yeah, I lived in Yosemite for 2 years at one point. I've thought about living all over the place, but I mean, this place is great for so many things. It's great for climbing, and my family lives here, so that's going to bring me home all the time. I'm pretty sure I'm going to live here for the rest of my life.
What's it like, Tommy, when you go someplace where climbing is the focus? Say it's a Real Rock Film Festival, or you're at a climbing gym, and it's not uncommon for somebody to ask for your autograph. Whereas then you come to Estes and you kind of have a low profile here. What's that like to switch gears from being recognized right away and then having a quieter life here in Estes?
I think it's pretty important for me to be able to have a little bit of a quieter life. Going to Yosemite, I've spent so much time there. It's a little bit exhausting to have people coming up to me all the time. Although, I mean, at the same time, it's great. I feel super lucky to be in that position, and if people can draw inspiration from what I'm doing, that's amazing. I mean, that's really incredible. But it is nice to come home, and I think the reason I'm more low profile here is because I know all the locals, actually. They know I'm just a normal dude. They're not going to come up to me and ask for my autograph generally, because, I see them at the restaurants, or I see them around town, and we're just all friends. So
I see. How do you pick your objectives in the park nowadays, in addition to bouldering? I know that you were on the Diamond last summer and did something pretty big up there.
Yeah, it's harder these days to find the big sport climbing or traditional climbing objectives. It's just been climbed out so much, except for the bouldering. There's plenty of bouldering that could keep me busy for the rest of my life around here. But I've spent so much of my life here that I've climbed almost every route in the area. And so if something pops up on my radar, whether I see it while climbing something else, or my dad mentions it to me, or one of my friends goes up and checks out just a part of the wall that I never thought about climbing on, that's the way that it's shown. I mean, for the most part, I'm not actually looking for big route objectives around here anymore, sport climbing objectives. But if one comes around, I get super excited about it. So I'll go and try and do it.
Nice. Do you remember the day you did the honeymoon is over?
Yeah, I remember that well. It was really amazing. I mean, this guy, Eric Daub, from Boulder, he had spent months up there putting in bolts and trying to decide whether it was a free climb, and eventually he decided it was a free climb, but he didn't think he could do it. So he called me up and told me about it, and kind of gave me permission to go and free climb a route that he had put a lot of work into, which was really generous. So I went up there with my dad again, and we climbed about halfway up the route one day, and the diamond tends to be pretty wet a lot of the time, so we ended up climbing into kind of a wet part of the wall and getting pretty soaked and having to rappel off. And then the second time I came back, we lucked out and the weather was good and it was dry enough to climb. And I had done so much bouldering and so much sport climbing but enough big wall climbing that I kind of had all the skills to do it at that time. So it was interesting. For these climbs have become a little bit famous around Colorado, but at the time that I did them, I didn't really think about that much, because I didn't realize that I guess I realized a little bit that I was pushing the standards, but I didn't, I thought that other people, if they tried it, they'd be able to do it. But that was a route that really stood out as I did it, and then people tried it for a decade after that, and then I think it finally just got climbed maybe a year or two ago by a friend of mine, Jonathan Seacrest.
That's great. Tommy, was it last summer that you were up on the Diamond and you got involved with a rescue?
Yep, that was last summer.
What happened that day?
I was trying to free climb a route called the Dun West Bay, which Josh Morton he did a variation on it a few years before that, and he was the one that mentioned it to me. He thought if you just took the direct line, it would be a really cool route. So I started going up there like every other day or every third day. I started trail running to the top of Longs, actually, and then dropping a rope down and rappelling down and working on it by myself. And then I think it was the first day that I was going to go and try and start at the bottom and climb it. I went up there with Jonathan Seacrest, and we got to the North Chimney on a day in like August, and the Diamond is pretty popular. And the easiest way up to Broadway is the North Chimney, but it's pretty loose. There's a lot of loose rock, and so we got up there, and I think there was 4 or 5 parties trying to climb up the North Chimney to get to the big ledge, Broadway, and then they were all going to do different routes up above. But it's pretty common for that chimney to get chocked full of people and for people to be knocking off rocks. And that's exactly what happened. We got to the base and we decided to climb off to the right so that we wouldn't be below people and we wouldn't be in the line of rockfall. But got a few hundred feet up the chimney and heard a bunch of people yelling rock, and a bunch of rock came down the chimney. And I didn't really realize that anybody had gotten hurt at first, but I continued climbing up the chimney and eventually there were 3 parties that had sort of congregated in this one area right around this place where this guy had fallen, and we don't know why he fell, really. He might have gotten hit by a rock from somebody from above. That's most likely what happened. But it was funny, nobody had quite clued into the fact that this guy was really hurt. I think everybody was just hoping that he had just kind of gotten stunned. He had fallen about 50 feet, but he had bounced a bunch of times. And I got there and I took one look at him and I thought that he was really in bad shape. So we just started rallying everybody, and we organized a rescue as fast as we could. We got somebody to call the Rangers from Broadway and, on their cell phone, and then we fixed ropes all the way down the chimney, and then the Rangers got there, and we hauled up all, gurney and all the rescue equipment, and it was a pretty hair-raising rescue because I think there ended up being 7 of us right around this guy trying to get him in a gurney. It was pretty obvious that his back was broken and he was covered in blood, and his neck was broken as well, and a bunch of ribs, and he had punctured a lung, and he was in really bad shape. And we were on these teetering blocks of choss, and we had to figure out how to get him in the gurney and get him on an IV, and it was pretty amazing to work with the rescue squad here in Rocky Mountain National Park and have them direct everything and see their systems, but also be able to help out. And we ended up getting him down, and I'm sure that the rescue rangers, along with us, saved this guy's life. So
Wow,
it was a pretty
that's
crazy
huge.
thing. I'd never seen, all the time I've spent in the mountains, I'd never seen anybody get hurt that badly. So
Yeah. Did it really bother you? Did that stay with you, or were you able to kind of separate that experience and come back and work on your objective?
It didn't bother me too much, and I think that people who climb a lot, they tend to think that they know how to avoid dangerous situations like that. And some of that may be true, and some of that may be just us wanting to keep doing what we're doing, so we justify it that way. I looked at that situation and I said, I wouldn't have climbed below people in the chimney. And I just decided that, if I was in that situation, I probably wouldn't have gotten hurt. So it didn't bother me that much. Since then, like when I was in Patagonia, a friend of ours died, and he died doing something that I did 50 times while I was down there. His rope got caught, he pulled on it, and he pulled a block on his head. And so that, when somebody dies, and I'm like, that could have been me, that bothers me a lot more. The one in the North Chimney, I was like, I wouldn't have gotten in that situation myself. Most likely.
Well, it's a certain kind of awareness that you get only with experience, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure.
So then you returned to do the Dun West Bay, and you succeeded at that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna just finish with a couple more questions. I'm curious, Tommy, since you've grown up here, have you seen changes in the climbing community?
I've definitely seen a lot of changes in the climbing community. When I was a little kid, the climbing community I knew was all around the Colorado Mountain School. The Donahue family was the center of it all. It was very humble. It was kind of magical in my mind from that day. All these people were just living only to climb. Mountain guides made no money at all, really, but they had all these clients that would return to the mountain school every year, mostly just because they loved the Donahues, and it was just a really cool environment of nature lovers, really. And then I started to see more climbers come to the Estes area, and then my dad was at the forefront of the first sport climbing that went on here. Before we even found the monastery, he was bolting climbs at Lumpy Ridge, and this was hugely controversial. And so he would put up a sport route, someone would come along and chop all the bolts, and there became a pretty distinct divide. And I saw there was like the traditional climbers, and then there was like the sport climbers, and they really didn't intermingle. It was like this big wave surfer. It was like the longboard surfers and the shortboard surfers. They'd get in fights, and they would always be arguing. And so there was a period of time where I was trying to decide where I was on that, and I kind of took the sport climbers approach. I thought that was the way forward, and there was a lot of ego involved for a long time. And then I think years later, it kind of all came back together, and I think it had to do with Lynn Hill and the Hubers that had kind of taken the sport climbing approach, but then come back around and been pushing the limits of traditional climbing. So those traditional climbers all of a sudden were like, oh man, I guess sport climbing is the way forward even for us. And so a lot of that ego and the bantering stopped, and it seems like these days people just get along a lot more and just go into the mountains and enjoy it without really thinking too much about, who's accomplishing what, or and that's my perspective. I don't know. Other people could have a different perspective. But now I think the climbing community is super cohesive. Estes Park is now seen as a great place to come and get the tools to take to other places in the world. It's a big bouldering hotspot, and there's a lot more energy around it here now, which is great. And there's all types of climbers. I mean, there's thousands of people that come here to climb on Lumpy Ridge and climb the easy routes, and it's recreational climbing, and it's a great experience. And then there's the best boulders in the world that will come here to do their climbing, and then the alpine rock climbing is beautiful, and all types of climbers come here, and it's a great climbing scene now, I think.
Yeah, climbers of all disciplines, but also different ages too.
Yeah.
And you might have had some part in that, this acceptance of younger and younger people being trusted up, on these slabby climbs or crack climbing. At least with bouldering and sport climbing, it seems like kids are encouraged to try it, and we got a lot of young athletes coming to Estes Park as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. My dad was trying to teach the local climbing, just like the local climbing program for the school for a while, and most of the parents here in Estes wouldn't let their kids go climbing outside, even sport climbing. It was pretty frustrating for him, but I think the paradigm has just shifted. I mean, when climbing for the longest time was thought of as an extreme sport that was only for crazy people, and people are realizing that you can make it safe, and even going into the mountains can be safe. So now it's something that families do together, or little kids can do. And you've seen this in Europe for a while. When I was 19 or 20, I used to go to France every winter for a couple of months, and you go to Fontainebleau and you'd see the 5-year-old kid all the way up to the 9-year-old grandpa all climbing together. And it was this thing that, for the most part, didn't exist in the United States, but my family was like that. So it was really cool to go and see that there. And now I think it's starting to become more common. And it's a great thing for families to do together. And it's a cool thing. I mean, it's amazing for kids. Kids are they have a great strength to weight ratio. They need excitement in their lives. They want the adventure, and climbing provides all those things for them. So, Estes is good at any place for kids to come climb.
Do you have any predictions about where the sport is headed?
It's hard to say. I think we're just going to see climbing continue to be pushed, and more people are going to get into it. I think right now one of the biggest changes is that climbing gyms are being built by the thousands around the country. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there's 50 climbing gyms in construction right now. So all of a sudden, places in the Midwest or in big cities are having climbing gyms, and they're actually starting to take over the fitness industry a little bit, because people are realizing, they're building these big, massive gyms that have all the traditional fitness equipment too, and people are being introduced to it that way. They come to run on the treadmill, and then they realize that climbing is a way more fun way to stay fit, and that's bringing probably millions of climbers into the industry. And so that's going to create a lot of excitement, and it's going to draw from an amazing gene pool of talent. So at the high end, it's going to get pushed a lot farther and a lot quicker than it probably has in the past. But also, you're going to see a lot more families out there, and I don't know. I feel a little bit lucky that my dad and my family were on the front end of that. We got to do it when we were some of the only people that knew the secret. That climbing was this amazing thing that we could do, and now everybody's going to learn about it, and that's great. But it's also going to create problems. I mean, there's going to be a lot more people in the mountains, and that's gonna, they have to make sure that they learn how to not abuse the resource, and stay on trails, and yeah, I mean, I think impact is going to become a bigger issue.
And I would think too, things like your Dawn Wall project are, again, kind of pushing that idea of where the possibilities are as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was lucky that I got into climbing at a time where I was at a place where I can try and find my niche and do something that people haven't tried in the past. And that's an incredibly motivating and exciting place to be. I mean, you feel like you get to explore something that nobody has. And yeah, that's really cool.
Are there any last stories you feel like sharing?
I feel like you touched on most of a lot of the good ones. Yeah.
Any last memories in Estes?
Nothing specific, I suppose. This is specifically for climbing oral history.
In Estes Park.
Yeah. You kind of touched on all the good ones.
Okay. Well, thank you for your
welcome.
time.
Yeah, no problem.